Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. This is Kathy, and today I'm doing something just a little bit different. I'm part of a group over on Facebook called Handmade Happiness, and it has been put together by Courtney Kreber. And each month in this group, there are hops that are organized, and it can either be a video hop or a blog hop. And the Handmade Happiness group is open to anyone, so I'll make sure to link to that group in the description box below. Anyway, for this month, the theme was to case a fellow creator. So I decided to case two cards that I saw over on Taylor McLean's channel. I'll make sure to link to her channel in the description below. And I'll show you her cards in just a moment. For my cards, what I did was I started out with a piece of Canson watercolor cardstock that I had cut down to an A2 size top folding card. So it's 4¼ wide by 11 inches long, and then I scored it at 5½. So that's your basic A2 size card. Next, I dabbed a little bit of Catherine Pooler's Tiara ink pad directly onto my nonstick craft sheet and got a paintbrush wet and just started to draw in some stripes on the front of my card front. I did tape down my card base just so it wouldn't move around, and also to mask off the back side of the card. Once I had the stripes painted in, I did dip my paintbrush into the ink and added some splatter to the background. Next, I started working on the elements for my card, and for that I'm using the Piece of Cake stamp set and the Happy Birthday stamp set. Both are from Honeybee Stamps. I arranged the images in my MISTI and then stamped them onto a piece of Cougar Super Smooth cardstock with My Favorite Things Extreme Black Hybrid ink. Both the cardstock and the ink are safe for alcohol markers, and I'll be doing some Copic coloring today. For the cupcake wrapper, I started out with R29 and literally just traced the lines on the cupcake wrapper because the areas, the way the lines are drawn, that's where the cupcake wrapper would be dipped in, so that's where I wanted to have the darkest areas be. Then I came in with R14 and I added a line on either side of my first line and made sure to leave some white space for a nice highlight. I was going to use R22, but I thought that it might be too similar to the other two red markers that I used, so I brought in R02 instead. When I filled in the white space for the highlights, I was not really happy with that cupcake wrapper, but I also know that with Cougar Super Smooth, sometimes it's best to let the ink settle in and then go back to add more color. So I moved on to the strawberry. The coloring for the strawberry is pretty straightforward. I'll make sure to have all of the products that I used as well as all of the Copic markers that I used in the description box below. So about casing a fellow creator, the reason that I chose these two cards from Taylor is because the one with the flowers and the striped backgrounds really caught my eye. When I first saw the card, I thought that it was background paper that she had used. And then when I watched her video and saw that she just did watercolor stripes down the front, I thought that is something I can do. Watercoloring is not really one of my strengths, but I figured I could do some stripes. And she did mention in her video that they didn't have to be perfectly straight because the more hand-drawn or more wonky that they looked, the better. And I'm all about that because I knew there was no way I was going to get a straight line because I can't draw a straight line even with a ruler. The other thing that really drew me to that particular card was how bold the sentiment was down in the bottom right-hand corner. And then the fact that she colored the flowers in blue was another thing that really attracted me to that card. I thought it was balanced very well, and I just love the whole layout about the card. The second card was really very inspiring because the only thing that she stamped on that card was the sentiment. Everything else was just patterned paper that she had cut out, and then she had stacked die cut frames to add some dimension and then added foam tape to the back of the images that she had fussy cut. And that is something that I never really think to do. I have patterned paper. I don't have a lot of 12 by 12 patterned paper, but I never think to actually use images from a piece of patterned paper to become a focal image on a card. So that's basically the reason why I chose to case these two cards by Taylor. So getting back to the coloring, I had finished the flower, which of course I did my most favorite thing right now, which was to add a blue-violet marker to underpaint on a yellow flower. I knew I was going to be die cutting all of the images out, so when I was coloring in the cupcake cake portion, I wanted to make sure that I went down far enough so that there wouldn't be a white space at the bottom there. To color in the chocolate cupcake, I started with E57 and added that underneath the frosting and brought it in a little bit towards the center, and then I went over that with E25. I jumped down to E21 but quickly realized that that was going to be way too light. So I reached over and grabbed E23 and I liked that much better. For the frosting, I started with E21 and just pretty much outlined it and added the shadows where the frosting would kind of be sitting on top of each other, and then blended that out a little bit with E51 and then finished it up with E50. For the stem of the strawberry, I just used two colors, YG17 and YG03. After I was done with coloring the cupcake top, I went back to that cupcake paper, or the cupcake wrapper, and decided that I needed to have more shadows in there. So I came back in with my darkest color, which is R29, and darkened up the creases of the cupcake wrapper, and then did flick lines from the bottom going up and then from the top going down. I did use it really very sparingly though, because I didn't want it to get too dark too far down in the center. I blended that out with the R14, again flicking up from the bottom and down from the top. And then I blended that out again with the R02. Once I had that done, I thought I needed to blend it out even a little bit more, so I brought back the R14 and then went over it one more time with the R02. That is one thing with the Copic markers, is you can keep blending and blending and blending if you're not happy with how something is turning out. And 99% of the time it can be salvaged or saved, so don't just throw it in the round file right away. The one thing that I do suggest, if you do continue to go over stuff, allow the ink to settle in and dry a little bit before you keep adding layers and layers and layers. That is one thing that I tend not to do, although I'm getting better at it. And I've noticed that if I don't wait long enough, it just becomes kind of splotchy and the colors don't blend very well. So that's my tip for that, is allow the inks to settle in a little bit before you go back and add in more layers. Now for the cake plate, I decided that I wanted it to be a white cake plate rather than a transparent, like a glass one. So I used my cool gray markers. I started with C3, and as I added the C3 along the scallops that are on the top part of the cake platter, I didn't take the C3 all the way down to the stamped line. There's just a tiny little bit of white space between the stamped line and where I actually added in the C3. When I was working on the bottom part of the pedestal, I just added shadows directly underneath the very top part of the cake plate and then along down the sides. And as I was looking at it, I thought it's kind of starting to look like an elephant foot. Granted, an elephant foot with a couple of extra toes, but I was trying to figure out what I could do to add something so that it didn't look like an elephant foot. So I used the C3 marker and added in, I'm going to call them pleats because this is the technique I would use for pleats on clothing, which is basically just doing a swipe up and having it be like a kind of like an inverted ice cream cone. So it's wider at the bottom, and then as I flick the marker up, it gets thinner and thinner and comes up to a point. After I was done with the C3, I came in with the C1 and blended that out, making sure to leave some white space in the center of the cake plate as well as in between the little divots that I put in when I colored in the pleats on the bottom of the pedestal. Then I came in with C0 and blended all of that together. I made sure not to go over the other two gray markers with this C0 too much because I didn't want it to pull out all the darker colors and, you know, take away from the shadows and dimension that I had put in there. After I was done with all the coloring, I had run the images through my Gemini Junior with the coordinating dies and started to work on the front of the card. I placed the big word birthday and I stamped that with VersaFine Onyx black ink, and I did stamp it 3 times just because I wanted to make sure that I got a really good impression. Then I placed the little word happy and I stamped that with VersaFine Onyx black ink as well. Next, when I started to play around with all the bits and pieces, I did trim off the white edge on the bottom of the cupcake wrapper because the cake plate has a white edge and I didn't want the white edges to overlap. So by cutting that off, I made it appears to me that it's sitting more on top of the cake platter. To make sure that I was able to keep the cupcake top in place with the cupcake wrapper, I used a little bit of AdTech tape runner just to hold it in place. Then I put a whole bunch of foam tape on the backside of that cupcake and added that to the front of the card. I used liquid glue to adhere the flower on the cake plate, and then I added the strawberry down at the bottom just to pull some of that red color down towards the right hand side and also to balance the bottom out because the word happy was stamped up above birthday. Then I had this genius idea to add sprinkles to the top of my cupcake. So I used these micro beads, and I've had them in my stash forever, and they should really be called micro beads because they are so small and they bounce everywhere. But I found the easiest way to get those to stick was to put a dollop of glue, liquid glue, onto a piece of scratch paper, and then I used, well, it's a dental tool, but I used a dental tool to pick up some of the glue and just do tiny little dots on top of the frosting. Then I very carefully poured those micro beads over and let them sit there for a minute. I know it doesn't look like it because I've got the video sped up, but I did let it sit for just a little bit, and then I very gently pressed down on those micro beads to get them to really stick into that glue. Then I tapped off the excess beads from my card, and they go everywhere. I was chasing them. I'm still chasing them. They're still everywhere. Anyway, so that finishes up my first card. Now for the second card, I pulled out a piece of 12 by 12 paper that has been in my stash forever. And of course, the birthday cake that I wanted to use was right smack in the middle of that patterned paper. So I carefully cut that out because I thought, since it was two-sided paper, I'm going to try and use as much of this cardstock as I can. So I flipped it over and I created a frame using 2 of the Wonky stitched rectangle dies from Whimsy stamps. And I also die cut that frame from white cardstock 3 times, and I stacked all of them up. After I cut out the cake that I wanted to use for the focal image on my card, I did adhere it to a piece of scratch cardstock because the patterned paper wasn't very thick. It was a pretty lightweight. So just to add some stability, I adhered that to a piece of cardstock, and then I fussy cut that out. Next, I had already stacked those frames, and I just used liquid glue to adhere those to the front of a top folding A2 size note card. And that card base is 80-pound Neenah Classic Crest cardstock. I had stamped a sentiment from the Penguin Poop stamp set, also by Whimsy Stamps, using VersaFine Onyx black ink onto a piece of scrap cardstock and ran that through with a banner die from Trinity Stamps. In hindsight, I wish I would have added ink around that banner just to make it stand out a little bit more. I just used liquid glue to adhere that to the front of the cake there. And to finish it up, I used my Wink of Stella glitter pen and added sparkle to all of the white parts on the cake. and then I used some Nuvo drops and I put a drop in the center of the flower, and then for whatever reason I started adding Nuvo drops all over the background and I couldn't seem to get myself to stop. So I'm not sure how I feel about all of the extra Nuvo drops. I think I like it, but let me know what you think. Drop a comment down below and tell me if I overdid it with the Nuvo drops. Anyway, that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to check out Taylor's channel. Like I said, I'll have it linked down below. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.